Did you know that there is a small island in the middle of the Indian Ocean where everyone speaks Dutch? What if I told you that this tiny speck of land was once the most powerful corporation in the history of mankind? Before Coca-Cola, Apple, or even Amazon, there was the Dutch East India Company. So how did a small group of businessmen from the Netherlands become the richest company in the world? And what happened to them after they lost their monopoly on spices? To answer this question, we have to go back to the 16th century, because the Dutch East India Company didn't just pop up out of nowhere. The story of the VOC actually starts with the Portuguese, who in the 15th century started discovering new trade routes to Asia. While most Europeans at the time thought that the earth was flat, two Portuguese explorers named Vasco da Gama managed to find a sea route to India by sailing south around Africa. But while this was great news for Portugal, it was actually terrible news for everybody else in Europe. You see, for the last 100 years, the Italian city-states had been controlling the trade between Europe and Asia. Since nobody else knew any other way to get to Asia, the Italians had complete control over what goods got to Europe and what price those goods would be sold for. But now that Portugal had found another way to get to Asia, Italy's monopoly was over. Of course, this wasn't going to sit well with the Italians. So in 1511, the Ottoman Turks attacked the Portuguese-held city of Hormuz. And with that, the wars between Europe and the Middle East began. Over the next 25 years, the Middle East would be completely devastated by warfare, and global trade would come to a screeching halt. So when the Spanish king asked his buddy, the King of Portugal, if he could join him in attacking the Ottomans, the Portuguese king said yes, but he also had another request. He asked the Spanish king to help him conquer and convert the Muslim Malaysians to Christianity. So while the Spanish were fighting the Ottomans in the Middle East, they were also helping the Portuguese fight the Muslims in Asia. And while both of these wars were very beneficial for the Portuguese, it would also make them some pretty powerful enemies. As the Portuguese were conquering the Middle East and Asia, they were also encountering an abundance of black pepper. Black pepper was one of the most important spices in Europe, because not only did it make food taste better, it was also believed to cure all sorts of illnesses. For centuries, the Portuguese kept this discovery a secret so they could make lots of money selling pepper in Europe. And since they controlled the trade routes, they could dictate exactly how much pepper got to Europe and what the price of the pepper would be. Because of this, black pepper would become one of the most expensive commodities in Europe. If you wanted to buy a pound of black pepper, it would cost you the equivalent of $120,000 today. But as you can probably imagine, the Dutch were too happy that a tiny little country like Portugal was getting rich by controlling all of the spice trade. They wanted a piece of the action. But before the Dutch could do anything, they had to solve one big problem. See, the Dutch were still under the rule of their nasty neighbors, the Spanish. And the Dutch had been trying to break free from the Spanish Empire since 1568. By 1580, they had broken away from the Spanish rule and declared themselves the Dutch Republic. But while the Dutch were able to win this war, it took them over 80 years to do so. And during those 80 years, they weren't exactly making money. So in 1595, a group of wealthy Dutch merchants banded together to form a shipping company called the Dutch East India Company. Their goal was simple: beat the Portuguese to Asia and get their hands on some of that sweet, sweet spice money. So in 1595, they sent out their first fleet of ships to sail to the Far East. Unfortunately, 30 of the 60 ships would never return. Of the 2,000 men that went on this journey, less than half would ever return home. But despite being absolutely decimated by disease and starvation, the ships that did return back to the Netherlands were extremely profitable. Just one single ship returned with over 5,000 pounds of spices, worth the equivalent of $2 million today. With results like this, it was not long before every wealthy Dutchman invested as much money as they possibly could into the VOC. At first, things were looking great for the VOC. They were able to build factories and trading posts throughout Asia and Africa. But then they ran into a problem. You see, the VOC wasn't the only European company trying to get their hands on some spice money. Soon, they were competing against the Portuguese, the English, the French, and the British, all of whom wanted to take the VOC down. In fact, it would only be a matter of time before the VOC was forced to fight a war against the English, the Portuguese, and the Spanish, all at the same time. But before we get into the VOC's domination of global trade, if you're enjoying this video, please hit the like button. And while you're at it, why don't you subscribe as well? Okay, now back to the video. So as the competition for the spice trade increased, so did the violence. In 1623, the Dutch governor of Ambon Island tortured and killed 21 men, 10 of whom were English traders. This event would come to be known as the Amboina Massacre. Naturally, the English were furious, but the Dutch were equally upset. Each side blamed the other for starting the conflict, which would eventually lead to the Anglo-Dutch Wars. A series of conflicts fought between the English and the Dutch from 1652 to 1702. For the next 50 years, the English and the Dutch would battle each other across Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and even North America. But even though the wars were extremely violent and costly, it was actually really good for the VOC. Why? Because the VOC was given full permission by the Dutch government to use extreme force to protect their trading posts and employees. In fact, the Dutch government gave the VOC the same powers that they had. This meant that the VOC could wage war, sign treaties, mint money, and even establish colonies. So as the war raged on between the English and the Dutch, the VOC spent billions of dollars today building massive fortresses to protect their trading posts. Within a couple of decades, they had built 13 major fortresses across Asia. With these fortresses protecting their trading posts, the VOC was finally able to start focusing on growing the company. Between 1640 and 1670, the VOC established an extensive network of trading posts from South Africa to Japan. The VOC focused primarily on three main commodities: spices, textiles, and precious metals. They traded manufactured European goods such as textiles and tools for gold, silver, and copper in Japan. Then they would use these precious metals to buy luxury items such as silk and porcelain in China. Finally, they would sell these goods throughout Asia and Europe for a huge profit. With this three-step process, the VOC was able to maximize their profits and take full advantage of the demand for Asian goods in Europe. But while this may sound like a simple process, it was quite difficult to pull off. The VOC had to constantly contend with pirates, other European powers, and even hostile locals. But none of this mattered because the VOC had something that no other company had: a monopoly. Since the VOC was chartered by the Dutch government, they were the only company that could legally trade with Asia. This monopoly allowed the VOC to manipulate supply and demand in order to maximize their profits. And since they were a massive company with a lot of money, they were able to control most of the spice trade in Asia. But by the 1680s, the VOC was beginning to show signs of weakness. The Japanese stopped accepting silver in exchange for goods, which left the VOC without a way to buy luxury goods in China. Also, the popularity of spices in Europe began to decline, which meant that the VOC had to find new products to sell. In 1720, the VOC was importing coffee, indigo, and cotton instead of spices. And while these goods were popular in Europe, they were far less profitable than spices. The VOC tried to combat this issue by expanding their operations into other parts of Asia. They began exploring the island of Dejima in Japan, where they grew cotton for the textile industry in Europe. They also began exploring the jungles of Borneo in search of new plants and animals. But as the VOC continued to expand, they were met with even greater competition from the other European powers. As the French, British, and Portuguese began competing for territory in Asia, the VOC's trading posts became targets of attack. And since the VOC was already strapped for cash, they couldn't afford to keep defending their trading posts. So, in 1799, the VOC ceased to exist. And while the VOC is no longer around today, their impact on the world is undeniable. They were the first multinational corporation and helped pave the way for companies like Shell, Exxon, and Apple. The VOC also helped spread global trade and connect Europe to Asia. Finally, the VOC was the first company to ever have a monopoly, which allowed them to control the supply and demand of certain goods. This gave them the power to dictate prices and manipulate economies, something that no other company had ever done before. Now, check out how the English East India Company destroyed an entire empire. Or click this other video instead. But please do not click this video. I beg of you, do not click this video. Please.